here today. We've had a great set of papers in the prior session, as well as the excellent keynote address that our colleague Silvia Mejia presented. And the theme continues here because this next set of papers is another excellent, very interesting papers that continues the theme of resilience and aging. And let's see here. And what I'll do is I'll introduce the speakers. We have first Elizabeth Munoz from the University of Texas at Austin. Then we have Sara Aguilar Navarro from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And is she on the, okay, perfect. And then we have Iram Beltran Sanchez from UCLA. And then we have Gladys Maestre from University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, my alma mater, when it used to be Pan American University. And then we also have, we're providing the discussion will be Elizabeth Vasquez from SUNY Albany. Okay, and we'll go ahead and start, and it'll be Elizabeth will go first.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I tend to speak low, but I try to project. So thank you for the invitation to present some of my work here today with you. I'm excited to share this today. So yes, my name is Elizabeth Munoz. I'm an assistant professor in human development and family sciences at UT Austin. So I'll kind of glide through these slides because I don't have to convince everyone here that looking at the effects of predictors of cognitive health in Latinos in the United States is an important effort to pursue. We know that our population is growing. We're also at higher risk of cognitive impairment and ADRD or Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And also acknowledging that there's diversity within the Latino population in the United States. So we are diverse in terms of multiple factors, including country of origin, and Mexican origin individuals make up over 60% of US Latinos. And we're mostly concentrated here in California, in Arizona, and Texas. And so in this study that I'll be presenting and another set of results, I'll be focusing particularly in Mexican origin individuals in the United States. And so even though we know that in general, racial and ethnic minoritized individuals are disproportionately exposed to social, environmental, socioeconomic adversities, objective indicators of these factors do not always explain the differences in cognitive health outcomes, right? So growing evidence points to psychosocial stress factors as relevant mechanisms of racial and ethnic disparities in cognitive health. And specifically thinking about psychosocial stress, which I refer to as individual level subjective perceptions of stress that are shaped by our environment, social and structural and economic structures. And a whole number of studies, including work by myself, has shown that psychosocial stress is associated with poor cognitive health outcomes, including cognitive function, cognitive decline, and neuropathological health outcomes. But the problem with the measures, the typical measures of psychosocial stress, is that they're very general and broad and not specific to the source of stress. So they don't tell us anything about the reasons why individuals may feel stress. And one unique source of stress for racial and ethnic minoritized individuals, including Mexican individuals, is experiences with discrimination. And perceived ethnic discrimination basically relates, and specifically focusing on ethnic discrimination. So feeling like you're being treated badly or unfairly in your everyday life because of your ethnicity is a unique source of stress that has been postulated to activate psychological and physiological stress responses that may lead to reduced cognitive function in the moment by reducing attentional resources, but then also over time if it's chronic and consistent. And perceived ethnic discrimination has been associated with a number of mental and physical health outcomes, and increasing evidence shows that discrimination may also be linked with cognitive function in Latinos. So a study that Dr. Lamar just discussed, she found associations with a composite score that included discrimination along with other social stressors was linked with poor cognitive functioning. One of the limitations of this literature is that we only have cross-sectional associations. So single assessments of experiences of discrimination or experiences of stress. But we know if we think about the stress literature and early conceptualizations of the detrimental effects of stress on cognitive health and physical health, we know that thinking about longitudinal exposures to stress experiences is important to consider. So if we think back to Bruce McEwen's conceptualization of chronic stress, which is the wear and tear from too much stress or inefficient stress responses, here he shows that acute exposures to stress, so a single exposure to stress, it's not detrimental if an individual is able to adapt to that stressor. But if the stressor is consistent or an individual is not able to adapt to that stressor, then that can lead to poor cognitive health outcomes, including poor brain health outcomes. So specifically thinking about this condition here that I highlighted, assessing repeated assessments or getting data of repeated assessments of experiences with discrimination could help inform us on the amount of exposure and also the timing of exposure and how that might relate to cognitive health outcomes. And so in this first study, we wanted to look at the longitudinal experiences of with perceived ethnic discrimination across 12 years of assessments. We wanted to look at the trajectories of experiences, but then also how these experiences may vary across individuals. So do they consistently experience high discrimination, low or variable discrimination, like thinking back on McEwen's conditions of chronic stress. And then also we wanted to look at whether that's associated with cognitive function. So this paper was co-authored with Gina Sutin and Rick Robbins, who received funding to collect cognitive data on the parents from the California Families Project. So this is a study of youth and their parents who were living in Sacramento in California, Sacramento and the Woodland, California School District. And here we focused on the parent data, which led to over 1,100 parents at baseline. We had over 60% were female, 85% were born in Mexico. And we captured their data at baseline, they were 38 years old, and then we followed them across 12 years. The data followed them throughout 12 years. And here are some descriptives. So we had longitudinal measures of perceived ethnic discrimination from baseline all the way through wave 11, which spanned 12 years of assessment. So here's 2 sample items. Participants reported 2 items such as you're treated with less courtesy than other people because you're Mexican or Mexican American. And they responded from 0 to 3, never to always. And then we had cognitive function measure, a composite cognitive functioning measure at wave 11. So that's one limitation of this study. We accounted for baseline IQ, so the effects were relative to baseline IQ, accounted for education as well as age. I didn't put that there. And then we also looked at differences by gender, nativity, and language of interview. So in the interest of time, because I just learned I had 15 minutes to talk about this, I won't go in detail about the analyses, but we did growth curve models. And then if we had significant variance in the growth trajectory, we fit growth mixture models to see if we could identify different profiles of change in experiences with discrimination. So here's the univariate growth curve model. We found that over time, experiences with ethnic discrimination declined on average. We do see that we saw a pattern whereby experiences declined and kind of plateaued between the last 2 waves. And we also had significant variance in the slope parameter, which led us to do pursue a growth mixture model to identify different classes of change. So through model fit indices, we found 2 trajectories through what we call 2 profiles of change. We had a profile that was consistently low across time. So they tended to report low levels of discrimination across the study period. And this is the profile that we call the stable low profile. yeah, the font is low, but we had the stable low profile. And then we had a profile that started off high at baseline and declined across time, like the average trajectory showed, but overall they were higher than the low stable low profile in ethnic discrimination reports. Now we wanted to look at who belongs to these profiles. We found that women were more likely to be in the stable low profile, so tended to report lower levels of discrimination. Those who were born in Mexico were more likely to be in the stable low profile compared to those who were born in the US, who were more likely to be in the high declining profile. And those who completed the interview in Spanish were more likely to be in the stable low profile compared to those who completed the interview in English, which I thought was very interesting and kind of motivated the next set of results that I'll talk about. But to just briefly talk about the results with cognitive functioning, we did find that the profile that was consistently low in cognitive function had a little bit higher cognitive functioning than the high declining profile. The effect size was pretty small, and the effect went away after we controlled for education, which kind of we can talk about that later. But then also at the last wave, we did see that higher discrimination was associated with lower cognitive performance at the last wave. Okay, so just briefly to discuss these results, we found that perceived ethnic discrimination declined over time. We found variability in the change trajectories that resulted in two change profiles, the stable low and the high declining profile. And we also had concurrent associations between discrimination at the last wave. And even though that effect did not vary by profile, we did find that the high declining profile had consistently higher levels of discrimination than the low declining profile, of course. Let's see, what else did I have here? Okay, yeah, so one thing that I thought was interesting and kind of pertinent to this session is that those who were interviewed in Spanish and who were born in Mexico and also who identified as women were more likely to report low levels of discrimination throughout the study period. And oftentimes, language of interview can be used as a proxy for acculturation. So in essence, low acculturated individuals reported lower levels of discrimination across the study period, which is consistent with previous evidence that shows that high acculturation is associated with more exposure to discrimination. So those who are highly acculturated experience more discrimination, which led me to two questions. Is lower acculturation protective to exposures of stress? And in order to kind of like, as I was looking through the literature, trying to understand this, I worked with another undergraduate student to look through the literature, and we found this study by Ruiz and colleagues that was published in 2018, and they proposed a model through which socio-cultural factors may protect Latinos against the experiences of stress. So here they proposed that sociocultural factors may moderate the experience of stress through appraisal. So the way that we perceive events, which then has downstream effects on psychophysiological mechanisms. So I was really intrigued by this idea. They proposed this model here, which also draws from a classic theory of stress, the Lazarus and Folkman appraisal model, through which when we're confronted with an event, we appraise it as either stressful or not. If it's stressful, then we have to decide how to cope with that event, right? So what are we going to do about this stressor? In their sociocultural moderation of stress appraisal model, the Lazarus and Folkman model is very individualistic. So is this stressful for me, and how am I going to cope with it? In this sociocultural moderation model, it's really more about Latinos drawing on their collectivistic values and social networks to think about, rather than what am I going to do about this stressor, what are we going to do about this stressor? So it's more of a we question. So to kind of test this model, because it was a theoretical proposition, to empirically test this idea and using ethnicity as a proxy for cultural values, we leveraged the data from the Health and Brain Aging Aging Brain Study, HAPS HD study that Sid O'Brien and colleagues lead. And this is data from Mexican Americans and non-Hispanic whites living in the North Texas area. And they have a measure of chronic stress that asks individuals, have you had have you had an event happen to you? Yes, no. How chronic has it been? And then also this appraisal question, how stressful has this problem been for you? And typically the way this measure is calculated is that it's a sum score. But I divided this scale into 3 components: the sum score of exposure, and also average course of chronicity, and importantly, the appraisal part. So how stressful do individuals report these stressors to be? And so preliminary results, we found interestingly that Mexican Americans report experiencing the same number of stressors than non-Hispanic whites. So they're exposed to the same stressors, but when it comes to the appraisal process, Mexican Americans report these events as being less stressful than non-Hispanic whites. And then delving a little bit deeper within the Mexican American sample, we leveraged the short acculturation scale and did a medium split and looked at the high acculturated versus low acculturated Mexican Americans. And we see that high acculturation is also associated with higher exposure to stressors and also higher appraisal reports. And then also preliminarily, we found that there are links with some cognitive scores that the HAPS HD data has, but we're still working on those analyses. So in conclusion, we find that ethnic discrimination is a relevant source of stress in Mexican individuals living in the United States. Longitudinal associations of experiences with discrimination vary within Mexicans by markers of acculturation. We find a possible resilience to the effects of stress for Mexican individuals that further varies by level of acculturation. And future next steps for this is that we need to identify sources of resiliency among low acculturation groups. So why do we find, at least behaviorally, more resilience in the low acculturated individuals, and also need to replicate these results with biological markers of stress. So is this resiliency only skin deep, or does it also have downstream effects to our physiological well-being? And with that, thank you for your time.
One, two, three.
Give me one moment, everyone. I'm just going to make sure that everyone else can see that. So.
One, two, three, four. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank Dr. Claudia Andrade and Dr. Silvia Mejia for the opportunity to participate in this symposium. My presentation is about the Brain Health Index as a predictor of possible vascular cognitive impairment in the Mexican Health and Aging Study 2012-2015 weight. I have nothing to disclose. Ischemic heart disease, stroke, and dementia are leading causes of the death and disability worldwide, notably affecting aging population. Vascular cognitive impairment refers to a variety of cerebrovascular pathologies that contribute to cognitive impairment. Vascular dementia is the second leading cause of dementia and accounts for up to 15–20% of dementia cases. When compared to Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, patients have both a higher cardiovascular burden and a greater level of disability, which in turn led to increase health-related costs. Vascular cognitive impairment are divided according to the level, mild or major. Major vascular dementia is possible to post-stroke dementia, subcortical ischemic vascular dementia, multi-infracortical dementia, and mixed dementia. On the other hand, possible vascular dementia was defined by stroke, and when neuroimaging is not available and clinical significant cognitive deficit in a less one cognitive domain with functional dependence are present. There is limited information concerning vascular cognitive impairment in countries such as Mexico. The poverty study analyzed 110 Mexican subjects with a first ever stroke and found 3 months vascular dementia prevalence of 12%. Based on the Mexican Health and Aging study, a prevalence of 0.6% of possible vascular dementia with an incidence of 2.2 cases per 1,000 person years have been recently estimated. The incidence of dementia has fallen in many countries, probably because of improvements in education, nutrition, healthcare, and lifestyle change. In the Lancet Commission showed 12 potential modifiable risk factors for dementia in the different stages of the life. Hypertension, alcohol, obesity in the middle life, or smoking, depression, or diabetes in the latter life. Modifiable risk factors account for around 14% of worldwide dementia, that the potential for prevention is high in a mild, be higher in low incomes and the middle income countries, where more dementia occur. Brain Health Index is defined as the capacity to function adaptability in the environment, with recent definitions emphasis to meet the need for a broader perspective and not only referring to the mere absence of disease such as stroke or as Alzheimer's disease. The Brain Health Index used in this study was derived from the previous proposal, the American Heart Association Life Simple 7, the Lifestyle for Brain Health Libra Index of the Maastricht study, and the cardiovascular risk factor age and dementia, the guided study in the Finnish to construct the Brain Health Index. For the task, we select factors where the reader for the question has a medical doctor diagnosis you with diabetes, hypertension, or myocardial infarction to determine the level of physical inactivity. For example, the participant had to answer no to the question, on average during the last 2 years, have you exercised or been engaged in hard physical work 3 or more times a week? The present symptoms were considered significant based on the cutoff with more than 5. The modified version of the Center of Epidemiology studies the person scale. Obesity was defined as a body mass index than 25, so report the body weight and weight and height. History of smoking consisted of a composite score of 2 of the following question. Have you ever smoked cigarettes? And do you smoke cigarettes now? Our research question, in the absence of effective treatment of the disease spectrum, cardiovascular risk factors are a potential target for the prevention of all-cause dementia. This study aimed to establish the association and risk detected by the Brain Health Index as a predictor of possible vascular cognitive impairment in the MHALS 2012-2015. Do you know vascular, the MHALS is a longitudinal core study of Mexican adults than 15 years old. The Brain Health Index considered for the study were diabetes, hypertension, myocardial infarction, depression, obesity, physical inactivity, and smoking. Possible vascular dementia was decline is scored in two or more cognitive domains in the gross cultural cognitive examination or for proxy respondents in the four-month questionnaire of cognitive decline in the elderly, EQ-COT, with one or more limitation in instrumental activities of daily living and history of stroke. A multinomial logistic regression model was developed to establish the risks of developing age-dependent variables, dementia, history of stroke, and possible vascular dementia. We use covariables age, sex, and years of education. In this flowchart, we show the sample selection in the baseline 2012 and the follow 2050 with participants with history of stroke, participants with new stroke, and participants no stroke, and cognitive impairment in the follow-up, possible vascular dementia, and possible vascular dementia with a new stroke in 2015. In this table, we show the participant demographic characteristics in 2015 follow. In case considered to have possible vascular dementia, the individual's mean age was 67 years, 35 were female, and the mean education level was 5.8 years. The possible vascular dementia group had a statistical significant higher education level when compared to dementia and the stroke groups. In the dementia groups, the mean age was 74.1 years and 63.7% were female. The history of the stroke group have a mean age of 65 and 48% were female. The cognitive impairment group had a mean age 64, 45 were female, and the mean education level was 5.8 years. Finally, the brain health index score in the possible vascular dementia group were 2.6 and 2.9 points. In the multinomial regression model for the brain health index and the diagnostic categories, the model was adjusted for age, sex, and educational level. In case with a higher score in the brain health index, the model revealed a hazard ratio of 1.63 for development for possible vascular dementia. The male sex yielded a hazard ratio of 3.7. The model show in the history of the stroke group in the even greater hazard ratio 1.7 for brain health index. Our conclusion. In this study demonstrates that the proposed in the brain health index is useful in determining the risk of developing possible vascular dementia. It also shows that the higher score, the greater risk of developing possible vascular dementia and stroke in Mexican adult age 15 years or older. It's important to underscore that the brain health index model reveals greater risks of possible vascular dementia independent of age, sex, and educational level in three diagnostic characteristics studies. Multimorbidity has been previously shown to be independent risk factor associated with mortality among other adults with hazard ratios 1.44. Multimorbidity is defined as the coexistence of two or more chronic condition or disease. Since most cardiovascular risk factors are considered chronic conditions, the development of tools to measure the impact of their coexistence rather than their individual contribution could be helpful to determine relevant outcomes like this case dementia. Finally, of course, our study also has few limitations, retrospective survey, the operational definition of the diagnostic categories, the surveys are not correlated with neuroimaging studies, and finally, the cognitive assessment used in the MHAS does not allow use to identify a cognitive profile among the participants, such as non-amnesic multiple domain profile, which could suggest vascular etiology with more certainty. Finally, I have to thank my college. And of course, I show you my team in Mexico City, in the Department of Geriatric Medicine and Neurology Geriatrics in the Instituto Nacional de Ciencias Médicas y Nutrición, Salvador Subirán. Thank you for your attention.
Oops, I changed the wrong slideshow, everyone. Sorry, forgive me. Changed mode there. So here you can just use the arrow to go forward there and then that arrow to go back, and I'll go ahead and hide this. Sorry, give me 1 second. Oh, it's already hidden. There we go.
Great. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I'm very grateful and thank you for inviting me to present. Jackie indicated that I had been an emerging scholar a few years ago. So before I actually start my presentation, I just want to take a few moments to thank Jackie and thank the organizers for inviting me to this session. But secondly, I also want to take a few moments to thank and appreciate Steve Wallace. So some of you might not know, but in 2014, Steve Wallace was the chair of the session in which I presented in this same conference. And when he introduced me to the audience, he said that I was had been hired at UCLA as an assistant professor. What he didn't mention, and this is very typical of Steve, was that he was the chair of the department. So he was actually very instrumental in my hiring. And a few years later, he was also very instrumental in my tenure process. So there is a lot that I want to thank Steve for all he did in my career and for where I am now. So I want to take just a few moments to thank Steve. And in memory of Steve, I hope I can live up to his promise, the research career that he had. So with that in mind, let me move into what I'll present today, which is assessing biological age in adult population. This is joint work with my longtime collaborator, Albert Paloni, and my other collaborators, Mary McInerney and Jijue Wang Fu. So the idea behind this assessment of biological age, doesn't want to go forward, so let me see if I can make it work. Oh, there you go. There have been several indicators that are being proposed to assess some underlying physiological deterioration. You might be familiar with some of these indicators, for instance, the metabolic syndrome, like the Framingham Index. And the idea behind of these indicators is to have a sense of whether a particular event might occur into the future. There have been a little more indices recently, for instance, like the allostatic load that not only includes biomarkers, but also trying to include indicators along the lines of stress and those type of experiences. So these type of indicators are relatively simple to compute because the idea is to use them in clinical settings. So that's kind of the idea behind. These are just some of the scores sometimes that they transform or they just add them up, like the metabolic syndrome. Biological age, on the other hand, has been constructed a little bit more elaborate because the idea is to try to get at the underlying biological deterioration or physiological deterioration. This is what some people are being calling like aging clocks, because in some ways what we're trying to address is aging as an indicator of time that might not necessarily go along the lines of chronological age. So under this approach, the idea is the biological age is going to include information of several, ideally several states. I hope you can see a little bit of this. Biological states like lipid indicators, sometimes like genetic markers, if possible, indicators of some neurodegenerative activity or epigenetic modifications. And however, that's kind of the general idea, but in most national level surveys, which is what I'm usually interested in using at the national level, we have just a handful of these type of indicators. So what I'm gonna focus now is on trying to use some of those handful indicators that we sometimes have at the national level to try to address how one might estimate some of these markers. So here is the idea of other indicators that have been used recently, in particular in the health and retirement study in the US, what is called the aging clocks. Most of these indicators use epigenetic markers, which are quite different from what I'll show you today. Although that is the interesting thing, I believe, about the work that I'm doing, that we can incorporate epigenetic markers, and I'll make a note of that towards the end. So the main methods that have been used usually based on this strictly linear association between biological age and chronological age. So most people assume there is a one-to-one relation between the two. One of the most typical indicators used in this area to estimate this biological age is by Clemeret-Duval technique, in which they propose this method that is fairly restrictive when one looks at it from a statistical point of view, because they not only assume a linear association, but it's a fairly strong linear association, that there is a one-to-one correspondence between what happens in chronological age and what happens in biological age. It is a one-to-one. What we are trying to do, however, our goal is to try to generalize that approach of trying to link the two. And we are going to do so through a structural equation model, because we believe the use of these type of models renders itself quite easily and clearly into trying to make this type of connections. So for example, under this approach, biological age is not measured, but it's a latent construct that one wants to extract using biological markers. And each biomarker is going to be linked with chronological age. And that is going to be kind of the key, how one links that connection. We're going to try to go beyond assuming a linear association and relax that assumption, but also allowing the possibility that biological age does not increase on a linear fashion with chronological age. And in fact, it might increase exponentially as age goes up. If you think about it, as you get older and older, the increase in biological age, in other words, the underlying physiological deterioration might speed up. And if that is the case, then we will be able to capture it if we do it in this fashion. What is interesting in here is that we do not constrain any of these parameters. Instead, we're going to let the data allow us to test whether those parameters are in fact linear. And if they are linear, then we go back to the traditional model. Even if they are linear, they might not necessarily increase on a linear kind of step fashion. So this is what we mean by generalized approach. So here is the general idea. We're going to try to test and create this indicator. The first is going to assume that there is a linear function, a linear connection between this biological age and chronological age. In the second, we're going to assume there is a non-linear connection. So to give you a sense of when one uses this type of models, this is kind of how we represent the models. Behind the scenes, we have a series of equations that one estimates, but I don't want to go so much into the details. But the idea is that we're going to use as many biomarkers as one might have available. We're going to try to link those with this latent construct that one is going to get out of the model. And the next step would be, how do we connect that with chronological age? So that's what I'll show you in the next steps, which is how do we connect these underlying factor scores. These are latent indicators that we can think of them as mapping this vector of known biological ages that come from these biomarkers, and how we're going to link them with chronological age. And we propose two ways of doing it. one that we call the outcome free, and the second, which I think is the most exciting one, if one can use that word, exciting. It is exciting in the sense that it is called the outcome dependent, and the reason why we believe it is interesting is because we believe biological age is not unique. It does depend on the outcome that one is interested in studying. For example, one might have an older age, biologically speaking, to cardiovascular condition, and yet be physiologically younger for disability or functional mobility, for instance. Or you can think of any other physiological systems. So that's the idea for now. To test the model, we'll use mortality to anchor this value. So very quickly, as I said, I'm not going to go too much into the details, but here is this basically what goes behind the scenes. When one uses the outcome free, one gets factor scores that in the first case, we are going to link them linearly with chronological age, and we let the slope and intercept tell us how fast that connection might go. In the case of the non-linear case, in the case of the outcome dependent, we go a little more elaborate because now we're going to use a hazard model. In our case, the hazard model is in terms of mortality. So what we are going to end up getting is biological age that is mortality dependent. But you can imagine instead of high mortality, we could anchor to any other outcome of interest, not necessarily mortality. So at the end of the day, what we end up having is 4 different results for each individual from the linear model, the outcome free or outcome dependent, and the same for the SCM non-linear. So those are the 4 outcomes. I'm going to be using the NHANES from the 80s. The reason why is because I have a mortality follow-up in 2015, from which I'll use the mortality to anchor the data. So this is a national representative sample. We're going to be using people from ages 30 to 75. That gives us about 9,100 individuals that I'll be studying. So here are the biomarkers that we are going to include in here, biomarkers from about 6 different physiological systems: metabolic, cardiac, lung function, kidney, liver, and immune function and inflammation. One could include as many biomarkers as one could have in the data. I'm only including these ones for purpose of comparability with other methods. So the results that I'll show you fairly quickly, so I think that's kind of the punchline. The results that I'm going to show you are 3 sets of results. The first one is what we call the age pattern. In other words, how those biological age look relative to chronological age when we compute it. Then we are going to try to link the difference between biological age and chronological age as an indicator of accelerated aging, meaning if somebody is biologically older relative to chronological age, is a little bit older, is accelerated aging. We're going to try to link that with race, sex, and education. And finally, I'll show you what would happen when somebody has an accelerated aging, what the impact might be on his or her life expectancy at age 65. So let's start with some of the results. First, the age pattern of mortality. For the methods, what you see now on the left-hand side males, on the right-hand side females, this is the line that one would obtain if we only look at chronological age as it comes from the data. So this is kind of the underground benchmark. So here is what it looked like if I were to obtain data from the other prior methods, like the principal components and multiple regression that, as you can see, produce fairly univariate distributions, fairly concentrated. If one obtains the values from our method, this is the red one, which is the outcome-free estimator, red for the linear model, is very similar to the underlying black line a little bit. In other words, it really represents the underlying age distribution. And here is what happens if one uses the nonlinear model. So in other words, the only difference between linear and nonlinear model, the nonlinear model tends to move the figure a little bit to the left. If we associate this with some of the interesting indicators, so for instance, here is the association between the difference between BA and CA with some markers like age, sex, race, ethnicity, and education. So I highlighted the pieces that I would like you to pay attention to. First, the method that has traditionally been used, which is on the left, the Clemeret-Duval. If one links this, it would assume that there is no link between how the difference between biological age and chronological age proceeds as one ages. There is no connection with chronological age. It would assume there are no sex differences between that accelerated aging, which one might think there is. If we, in contrast, use our method, we do find, in fact, that as one gets older, there is a larger difference between biological age and chronological age. And also, there are actually large sex differences. Women tend to have a slower aging relative to males. And also, Importantly, that if one looks at the most disadvantaged position populations, like non-Hispanic Blacks, non-Hispanic or Mexican Americans in this case, or those with low education, they tend to have a higher biological age relative to chronological age. And the last point that I would like to make is, if you look in the line right here, our method fits the data much better if one were to judge on a statistical perspective. The last piece that I'll show you are results on life expectancy. So the idea in here, this is what I'll be showing you. I want to walk you a little bit through the figure before I show you the results. So what I'll be showing you are the relative changes in life expectancy at age 65 for a given change in biological age. What that means is, if somebody has age 65 and his or her biological age is exactly 65, that individual would be right in the center. If the difference is positive, meaning the individual is biologically older and falls in this square in here, that means that individual is biologically older and has a shorter life expectancy. In contrast, if the lines are in here, that means the individual is biologically younger, because that difference is negative. And if it falls in this square, that individual is biologically younger at the same time that has a higher life expectancy. How high or how low the life expectancy would be is given by these numbers. So far, so good. So there we go. These are the results once we get from all the different methods. So what I want to point out is, if you look at the red and green values, those are the ones that come from our estimates from the structural equation model. In particular, the solid lines, the solid dots, the solid dots that are really high in here, these are the ones that come from the outcome dependent. So to give you an example, if somebody at age 65 is about 5 years younger, that individual would be expected to live about 70% higher life expectancy. In contrast, if that individual is 5 years older, we would expect that individual to live about 50% shorter life expectancy in the case of females. So what that shows is that our method seems to be more sensitive to picking up changes in the underlying physiological deterioration that is translated in either shorter life expectancy or higher life expectancy, depending on the direction in which biological age goes relative to chronological age. So with that, I will conclude with the general ideas that our method, the nonlinear form, seems to be more appropriate. We believe that is not necessarily the case that chronological age and biological age go hand in hand. We don't need to impose parameter constraints, as some of the models traditionally do. We can actually test if that is the case. Our results are somewhat comparable with other methods that have been used. I didn't show you the results, but if one uses some of the methods to test for the prediction, which like the area under the predictive curve, one would find our method is better. And in particular, the outcome dependent allows one to study this from the perspective of using other indicators. As I said, you could use, for example, I'm doing work now to look at diabetes. So somebody might be biologically older relative to diabetes, not necessarily relatively to say cardiovascular disease. So one, it opens the possibility to estimate this for several conditions. Another advantage is that because we are within the framework of this structural equation model, allows one to incorporate many pathway mechanisms that are not traditionally used, allows to use exactly as many biomarkers as one might have. So just very quickly, because I know I'm out of time, here is what would obtain if one uses the HRS. The values are very small. The only reason I wanted to show you this is because the other lines that you see there are from clocks, epigenetic clocks. So what I'm showing here is that one uses biological markers who are more widely available in surveys as opposed to epigenetic markers. One still obtains an indicator of biological age that is fairly reasonable, even if in the absence of epigenetic indicators. So finally, if you guys want to take a look at the paper, it was just recently published, like a couple of weeks ago, in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. So here is the reference, but I'll be happy to give you the slides if you would like to have them. So thank you.
one moment, Gladys. This keeps bouncing out to the larger screen and I'm just trying to drag it aside. Oops. Because it's once here. Oh, everything's. Just to move to the next slide, you just click this button here, that one there, and that should move you on.
I can do that. Buenos días a todos. It is a real pleasure to be here with you. And I have to say, I'm particularly honored to recognize the life and work of Dr. Steve Wallace. And also to have the opportunity to have three of the most important pillars, I think, in the study of Latinos and Hispanics in this country, which is Dr. William Vega, Dr. Kyriakos Marquides, and Dr. Angel. At least these three have been tremendously influential in my work, the selection of questions, and most of all of the work ethics. And also I want to acknowledge the people that are online. We wish you all were here because the energy in the room is amazing. I have to acknowledge, not only as a disclosure, but with a deep sense of gratitude to NIH, in particular, of course, our AD-RECMAR funding, our South Texas ADRC, which is a new one, the only one in Texas so far. But I'm going to be presenting most of this from one of my news initiatives funded by NIA, which is a DP1. And also it's possible because of the Texas Alzheimer's Research and Care Consortium. And I do have to declare that I have a small nonprofit working on the area. I don't know where that green, okay.
Sorry. I'm like, I don't think that's part of the design.
No, but I'm gonna tell you a little bit about why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, and also want to recognize the team. It's a tremendous, energetic, positive. It's a new team. I came to the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley at the end of 2016, and we were able to find questions of interest for a lot of us there. I'm gonna introduce why. I'm gonna tell you about place-based research, which is this new ground for me. I'm also going to tell you about neighborhood physical disorder and how are we measuring that. And I'm gonna share with you some of the preliminary results. How do you think of the right question at the right time? Some questions travel around the world for ages and seem to end up in the minds of different people right at the same time. This question in particular elicited our group to think, are our cities perpetuating isolation, inequality, apathy, and passivity? And we were able to bring together a team that actually this slide's not as current as I want to, but I want to highlight, you know, I don't know how to, but here in the picture, we have in the top file, we have our RECMAR scholars. In the second line, we have our most of our faculty, and in the very last with the mustache is Noé Garza, who leads a lot of the collection of the data on our programs with the promotoras in the Valley. In the third row, also at the very end, we have a philosopher, Dr. Angelica Potempa, and next to her, Dr. Michael Miner, who is actually from the business school. And in the last row, second to last is Dr. Gina Lovasi from Drexel University, and the last is Dr. Sura Seshadri, who are all implemented. Here embedded are some of the most important raters that we have for our neighborhood physical disorder. So we know that the type of big data that we get to use, it's could be either what we call biological, including everything that we can measure in the person, geospatial, geographically based, electronic health records, personal monitoring, and we also have now what's called effluent data, like Google search results and that type of things. And the traditional way is that you go deep in one of these and you make yourself an expert and you get the funding from the right institute and then you just stay there. Well, I think that's a false choice. And I think that I appreciate it very much, Dr. Bandiera in the morning, telling us how they are expanding this vision. And I think that's just the beginning of how we can create new knowledge and not only understand the effects of health disparities and the causes of health disparities. We are very focused on moving on to interventions and creation of new knowledge. So I think it's a false choice that one has to understand either the individual factors or collective factors. I think that the mitigating the risk of dementia and its outcomes is not an either or solution. I think researchers and the broader community, we should be attacking both individual and collective causes, because it is every single study says that individual characteristics, individual experiences, individual outcomes are impacted by the collective factors as well. And that's why we decided to initiate a place-based approach in the Rio Grande Valley. What is it? Many of you know, but I didn't know before I actually got into this. So the focus on place and therefore on groups of people connected by geography, instead of a focus on specific issues or separate individuals, is most effective one, addressing a spatially concentrated problem. Place is an efficient platform for delivery, and there is a potential to spill over to others in the community. So these studies are not looking to generalize or to include as much as possible. It's focused on going deeper and trying to understand and then envisioning what kind of interventions can we able to generate. So it's focused on a whole set of issues that the community faces and tackles issues in tandem, seeks to improve comprehensive results, and takes advantage of the synergy achieved by addressing multiple issues at once. So questions are very important, like, so what place to target? How to leverage the city resources already present in those areas? And of course, develop and test tier interventions. And that's what we have been doing through the community core of our Alzheimer's disease RECMAR. So the key elements of the theory of action for place-based work is, of course, engagement of the community through it, at least the minimum is asset mapping and needs assessment. Develop a focus on clear results and develop shared data tools. Integrate the existing programs, build the core capacities of the organizations and communities, We have to break down silos, and we need to capture what we do and share the learning. What is the role of a higher university, higher education institution, a Hispanic serving institution, the only officially bilingual in the nation? Be the anchor organization. We built a senior coalition. We are the anchor, provided dedicated staff, and lead processes with them. Build the processes like common agenda, develop and feed, share metrics, continuous communication, implement mutually reinforcing activities, and using clear results and data to improve outcomes. And this is our most, this is the traditional work, and we take that clear results and data. So this work, I think it's going to be expanded later. Shows that concentration of Alzheimer's disease in the nation, and you see the very black at the bottom of the country, and in the middle of the country, that's where Rio Grande Valley is. We started looking at, publicly available information like longevity, for example. We look, this is our area, and you can see at the bottom in the brown, yellow and brown, where Alzheimer's is concentrated, and in the other blue, where the Social Security beneficiaries are. And you see this, there is not a great match. And we started looking at, maybe people leave because of, Coco's work and the Hispanic paradox. Maybe people live longer in this area, and then maybe that's why we have more Alzheimer's. So we start looking at longevity. It's not apparent that that's the case. We look at area deprivation index, and that also wasn't a good match. We look at physical inactivity, and basically it's everywhere. So in this area, so it wasn't. And so we started to think about, and we say, well, first of all, is this population this is a good place for a place base? Aren't they just enter the country and migrate? And when we look at how long people stay or how much they move after they have grown up in the area, well, the Valley is one of the areas in the country where people is born and stay. So we focus on neighborhood disorder, which is the observed or perceived physical and social features of neighborhoods that may signal breakdown of order and social control. And the concept of neighborhood disorder is influenced by the broken windows theory, which states that visible signs of disorder and misbehavior encourage further disorder and misbehavior. Not gonna really go into what mechanisms, but there are some, very serious theory about it. So we decided to assess neighborhood physical disorder. And we decided to try to see if we can do this virtually using Google Street Views. There are different ways of doing this. We selected this with the help of our colleagues at Drexel University and set up a whole team for virtual audits using Google Street Views. We generated a manual, tested, includes more than 79 different categories. And then we were able to narrow down using some studying the psychometric properties and consistency and reliability, and explore different ways of selecting areas around the point and different paradigms. And these are basically our preliminary results. I'm finishing, but I want to tell you. So we basically assessed 700 points in the Valley. We look to see the spatial autocorrelation, because if they are closer to each other, they tend to be the same. So we wanted to see if this was what we expected, and it was. We look at the radar interreliability, which we found out some were almost perfect, some were fair. We deleted the poor, and we found out how they were related to the previous residents' experience. We look at specific items in different cities generating this, but also because we were using Google Street Views, we could assess how was the neighborhood, for example, 10 years ago, and see how the neighborhood physical disorder changed over time. So we can explore questions like that. This is a figure that reflects, and that's why one number about neighborhood physical disorder is not enough. I think generating the visual maps, for example, the top first is Brownsville, where you can see the brown is very low, meaning very high neighborhood physical disorder. So the conditions there, and 2/3 of the city are very bad, but still you have, because it's a very segregated area, rich and poor, whites and Hispanics, you see very dark areas, and you see very dark, like in the third one, which is Harlingen, for example, that the top at the corner where you see a lot of green, that's where our Institute of Neurosciences and a lot of medical institutions are. So the question is not what you look at, but what you see. So in summary, we think that place-based research opens opportunity for community action, refinement of gene-environment interactions, and opens new ways to identify novel pathways for mitigation of dementia. Virtual audits are a feasible tool, and we are looking forward to explore more towns, more cities. We've done Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte, Santiago de Chile, and Philadelphia, Manhattan, and we just concluded San Antonio. So if, we might be able to work with you if you are interested. Neighborhoods matter at a very granular level. We don't believe just a census tract is good enough to assess the impact of neighborhoods. And I think that we found that omics researchers are well suited to analyze the data because they are very much used to working with hundreds of contradicting genes, variables, and things like that. So thank you.
Sorry. No, that's all right. I'll leave everyone there for you.
Awesome. All right, thank you. Thank you for all those presentations. And I had to say, like, you'll hear this theme around today. I was an emerging scholar when I started here. I was brought into, I will say, the community that is Dr. Marquides, Dr. Angel, and my mentor, Ben Shaw, that is here when he was at Albany with me and introduced me to this cadre of people that are doing amazing work when it comes to Latino health. And I know we can go Latinx, Latino, Latina. I prefer Latina because I'm old. And I think for all the people, it just makes more sense. But those of you that are new generation, go ahead and continue doing that. But when I was asked to come here, like I started as an emerging scholar, and now I'm full circle. I'm a discussant. I'm like, I'm grown up. So, and I want to say that I'm reading through the papers and looking at the depth of methodologies that were expressed in this particular panel, we had to be aware that there are so many other issues that arise, not just when we think about stress in the paper with Munoz and thinking about why does the perception of stress changes as you get older? What are some of those factors that we need to continue looking at? And then we would move to brain health with the paper by Aguilar, and she's looking at this brain health and looking that not all the variables and all the methods are there to evaluate those issues. And I actually was in all of the biological age paper because that's the paper that I've been wanting to write for like 10 years. And to see that we come together at this level and we can make these predictions and move the field forward. And it's not just thinking about the paradoxes or the bilingual paradox that was thrown in the first section or the acculturation, but it's thinking about more broadly because Latinos are going to represent a big proportion of the aging population and we do not have those specific measures. So most of the measures for cognitive function, for age had been done in other populations. And what does that bring to the table? What do we try to bring in? And finalizing with this neighborhood environment and context by Dr. Maestri, it's incredible because she actually said most of the things that I wanted to say when it comes to, do we look at individual level or do we look at contextual factors? And as an epidemiologist, it's challenging. It's very, very challenging. We cannot think of aging as, I don't know if you saw that whole thing that aging is now an ICD-10 code. And you think about it, it's not a disease, it's a process, it's a continuum. And just thinking about how we get about it and how we need all these different pieces and components to really explain the direction of aging long-term. And I had to say that I want to hear the questions, so I'm going to stop right here. I'm usually long-winded, but I'm going to stop. And I just want to say that we have a lot of work ahead of us. And not just thinking about what measures are needed, but also as how do we interpret those measurements and how we move away from this expectation that Latinos live longer just because we had this context of familialism, but there are so many other variables that need to be represented in our equations and our modeling. So I'll stop there. Questions? Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Yes, a great job, everybody. Fantastic panel. My question is for Liz. Really great work with discrimination. I wanted to pick your brain if you could explain a little bit about how education may play a role in your findings, because from what I remember, you mentioned, right, that the people who were tested in Spanish, women and born in Mexico, were the ones that had the low and stable discrimination, right? And from at least from work that I know that from people in our group and others, we've seen this weird thing with education and discrimination where we see higher education is associated with more discrimination, and then it gets complicated with cognition because then we have higher education is better cognition. So we have some weird associations there. And some of the things I think I know my colleagues have been thinking is that because the higher education, you're more likely to be in more predominantly white spaces, that then that's why you're experiencing more discrimination. So wondering, given with the group that you mentioned, Spanish women born in Mexico, more likely to have low education, reporting low discrimination. What are your thoughts on that?
So we didn't find differences in, we didn't find significant differences in education between the two groups. But that effect that we had with the high discrimination group having worse cognitive functioning, that effect went away after accounting for education. Possibly because high discrimination takes away motivation to pursue education or kind of limits educational attainment that leads to worse cognitive function. In this group in particular, the Mexican American parents in the California Families Project. So I'm not sure if that will be the same for other groups of individuals. In the second paper, the second analyses, though, we do see that higher acculturation groups have more stress, which kind of goes into that idea that the more integrated you are in the majority culture, the American culture, then you're exposed to more stress, and then that could be bad for you. So yeah, it's really perplexing, and I think it's really dependent on the samples, and then thinking about how this looks also biologically, right? Because this is just behavioral data. But yeah, I agree with you based on the data, more like epidemiological data with education, and looking at the diminished returns of education too with African Americans who are highly educated, but that benefit of high education doesn't translate over to cognition too, possibly because of this idea that they're occupying more white spaces and experiencing more discrimination in those spaces as well. So. Anyone else?
have a question? Oh, yeah, sorry.
No, I would like to comment on this, and I appreciate very much. I think we need to study those environments. I think we need to study operation. You know, if we keep talking about health disparities, health outcomes, but the root cause we know is oppression. And how many studies of oppression? And this is, we're not talking about billionaires, you know, few, the ones that are benefiting from what's going on. So in terms of language and acculturation and stress, and even biological aging, I suggest we study oppression in those environments where people was at the critical windows. And now we can, and what we have now, I don't think that has changed substantially, I think. So that's my proposal.
Hi, everyone. I am an older physician now getting my MPH. And in the very first week of my MPH, we talked about the evils of segregation. And I wanted to raise my hand and say, but aren't there some protective benefits to, as I did growing up in Pilsen, a Mexican-American neighborhood, where I could roll out of bed and speak Spanish all day long, eat the food that my parents prepared anywhere in my neighborhood, and engage with people who looked like me and not experience oppression. And I wonder if that study is somewhere coming.
Who wants to take this one?
Thank you for your comment and question, and hopefully so. You know, I think that the geographical differences at the border of Mexico and the United States provide a great opportunity, because the segregation is quite high, and because so we can clearly establish where the different exposures are, and you can trace individuals where they have been and what they do and their perception of the oppression. And I think that all these factors that have been mentioned today, they are not ahistorical. They are rooted in history and in place as consequence. So I think we need to, and I will say I enjoy very much the metaphor of the river. I will add that the geological image of what's happening is also very important. There are many layers underneath that earthquake that we are seeing in this party. So hopefully we can put together our brains and develop some interventions so we can learn more.
Just have one more comment. That I think this also calls for, this highlights the need for longitudinal data, because in midlife, maybe this could be beneficial, but as individuals age and they don't have access to resources, and that could become a problem. So tracking that over time could also be important.
Just one final comment regarding this like operation that was mentioned within public health, in particular in social epidemiology. There has been more recently the focus on structural factors that we call, and those structural factors include like race and racism, along the lines of what has been common now with the critical race theory that comes basically from law, School of Law, in how certain laws are being passed to benefit certain groups. The typical one that you that reminded me with your comments of growing up in this particular neighborhood is the redlining. So that's a typical example of how these structural factors had an impact on how these neighborhoods were shaped. They were not just randomly put in that place. It's not random that you have a concentration of certain race ethnic groups with particular income distributions in those neighborhoods, and it goes back to the redlining areas, which had to do a lot with these structural factors.
Sure. Dr. Bothman Sanchez, I had a question about your biological age measurement, especially with regard to Latinos and sort of the Hispanic paradox. So do you get any sense that this biological age measurement is operating differently on the mortality outcomes differently by race and ethnicity?
It is, definitely it is. And something that I did not spend a lot of time on, but what the way we're conceptualizing this idea of biological age is not a snapshot. What we think it is the accumulation of all the past experiences that have led up to the point at which we are measuring those indicators. So it is indeed the case that you have these type of disadvantaged populations like Latinos that have gone through all these experiences, it would be more likely that they'll be disadvantaged and more likely to have physical dysfunctioning or dysregulation in certain markers. So it is not a coincidence that among Latino populations, the metabolic conditions are highly prevalent because of the experiences that they have gone through, which in a few years we also will have perhaps cardiovascular conditions. So yeah, I definitely expect those differences to emerge. And what is interesting, I think, with this underlying biological age is that it's not a disease. What we're trying to get is this underlying physiological deterioration that might or might not have manifested yet into a condition.
Well, thank you all for your presentations. So I actually have two questions for Iram. So one of them is thinking about biological and chronological age and your presentation that you discussed with us previously. How do you think your findings can be applied, let's say in the clinical setting or out in the real world? And then also I'm wondering if the methods that you used, that's my second question, the methods that you used, do you perhaps see them as be potential avenues for application when it comes to thinking about other ways of conceptualizing aging? So you talked about chronological and biological aging, but what about like subjective aging or other ways of defining aging? Do you think that the structural, basically the methods that you used, whether you think that would be appropriate for that as well?
Right, yeah, thank you for your questions. Yes, I think with regards to the first question, how one can use this, for example, the epigenetic clocks, the ones that I just briefly mentioned towards the end, some of those clocks are actually now being used clinically. There are some companies that have been now using those that get a blood sample from which they get these epigenetic CPGs regions, and then they try to estimate what the epigenetic age of these individuals might be. What's the usefulness of that? I'm not sure, because it's not been pointing to any particular physiological system or disease. And that's what I'm trying to go with my approach. My approach, what I did so far is to put all the biomarkers together and link them to mortality. But with this type of approach, you can collapse biomarkers into, say, indicators that are more prone to metabolic conditions. Those are more distinct to cardiovascular conditions. Those who are more distinct to, say, immune function. And then you can see how biologically might be sensitive to some of those mechanisms, to some of those particular physiological systems. The second step would be, to the extent that I were able to identify individuals who could potentially be biologically older in this particular mechanism, then the next question is there anything we could do to try to ameliorate that? One of the typical examples is medication. So for example, metabolic conditions or like lipid levels, now we have some medications that might control lipid levels. If that were to be the case, that perhaps one route, but yeah, it is possible.
Well, I mostly just want to praise presentations here, and I have a couple of methodological suggestions, and maybe you've already done these methodologies, and perhaps you could just point the rest of us to where we can find more information if it has already been done. But first of all, on this very important topic of oppression, I think that really the complexity, the depth of that topic needs to be explored qualitatively. And so I'm going to recommend that we do some future research on this whole topic of oppression and how it is perceived. Look at the narrative of those individuals who have survived the different forms of oppression, how they have used that as a method of resilience or as an additional stressor. And then specifically, I really want to praise Hiram's looking at non-linear models. I think that's where we're going to go in terms of quantitative methodology. And what popped into my mind, and maybe you've already looked at this, was maybe some sort of Bayesian sequential analysis in order to get rid of maybe the extreme heteroskedasticity that you might have in these kind of data. I'm just wondering, have you discussed this particular data set with someone like Sudipto Banerjee, who may be able to give you some ideas about the Bayesian sequential analysis? So that's all. Great job.
Thank you for those questions and suggestions. And well, I haven't talked to Sudipto yet, but yes, indeed, once we start going in this path, there are so many ways one can take. I want to describe one using kind of physiological systems from which we could have different latent constructs. So right now, I just have a single latent construct from all the biomarkers. You might as well get as many latent constructs as physiological systems you're putting in the data, from which you're going to start testing the sensitivity. That's one way to go. The second, which is what I'm already doing, is moving this forward with longitudinal studies, because what I just did in here was a cross-section. But then with the HRS, one has several waves in which we could be estimating these values as people age. And again, with the idea that this biological age measures the accumulation of these experiences, the question is how fast this biological age is progressing as the individual ages. So we are really capturing kind of this accumulation of experiences. I haven't gone to the area of Bayesian approach, but that's probably what I end up doing, either that one or the more general growth curve approach to try to get at these trajectories over time. Yes, thank you.
It sounds like we have to wrap it up. I just want to say this is amazing. And you can see the intersectionality with all these levels of public health and the methods, the context. So this has been a great panel, and I appreciate the questions, and stay because there's more to come. So it's going to be awesome. Thank you.
I was thinking that I should have been moving around because you've been moving around
it's
all morning
fine.
and all of that.
It's fine.
Yeah,
That microphone's not working properly. And so if that one was working, we would have been okay.
Thank you so much.
It's good that that microphone's not working properly. And so I've asked Omar if he has, oh, there he is. So all we need is one, so that when there's question and answer, they can answer the questions over there.
Okay.
So there's usually 4 of them sitting and they can just pass it between them and then we can hear it on the speaker.
No, it's going to come out of this speaker.
Okay, well, that's fine too.
Yeah, we don't
Yeah,
have 2 inputs.
yeah. That's okay.
Oh my God.
Thank you. Yeah.